waves of love and vengeance. The massive flagship, Vermilion Dawn, cut through the glittering ocean like a blade. Its sails, dyed a deep crimson, were visible for miles. Cannon portholes lined its hull, each opening bristling with iron menace, and on the forecastle deck stood the man at the heart of many legends, the General Alexander Blackwood. His name carried with it both fear and admiration, for in less than 10 years he had charted and conquered nearly every treacherous sea route in the known world. Now, under the sweltering sun, he surveyed the horizon, seeking new waters too tame. Standing well over 6 feet tall, Alexander carried himself with a regal air that belied his humble origins. His once rough hands had come to know silken gloves and gilded sabers, but he had never forgotten the grit of deck work or the sting of salt on fresh wounds. A single decorative braid of hair draped down the side of his head. Some said it was a good luck charm given to him by an old flame. Others claimed it signified his promise to conquer uncharted waters. In truth, he kept his secrets well, revealing them only in quiet moments that were growing increasingly rare as his reputation soared. Crew members hustled around the deck, tying off ropes, checking rigging, or carrying provisions for the long journey. Many of their eyes shone with respect and pride, for Alexander inspired loyalty in ways no other officer could. He had rescued entire villages from pirate raids, outsmarted cunning foes, and returned home with spoils beyond imagining. The bravest among them believed that no wave was unconquerable when he stood at the helm. Yet, beneath this veneer of reverence, lingered small cracks in loyalty. Gold, after all, could work its own form of magic, and Alexander's rise had not gone unnoticed by those who believed themselves more deserving of his glory, namely his king. If Alexander was the sea's unstoppable champion, the king was an envious puppeteer in the palace, pulling whatever strings he could to maintain power. For the moment, the crew believed they served both Alexander and the crown. But seeds of doubt began to sprout in the hearts of some, who wondered if Alexander's growing legend might threaten their own futures, or their purses. The sun sank low on the second day of the voyage, painting the sea in streaks of orange and gold. Alexander's first mate, a tall man named Corvin, approached him, while the rest of the crew prepared the evening meal. Corvin had a perpetual scowl, even in moments of triumph, and was known to be among the few who had Alexander's ear. "Admiral," he addressed, using the older title out of habit. Alexander acknowledged him with a small nod, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "The men are restless. They whisper about new orders from the king. They say we're headed for the Isle of Ivory." "And so we are," Alexander replied calmly, turning to glance at Corvin. "I've heard rumors of hidden reefs and monstrous waves near that island. Rumors also speak of a king's fortune in pearls. His Majesty wants the treasures for the royal coffers." Corvin gave a thoughtful hum. "They also say the merfolk dwell in the deeper waters around the Isle of Ivory. I've never seen one, but you know how the old sailors talk about them." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. Throughout his career, he'd heard countless stories about mermaids, mythical creatures with the upper body of a human and the tail of a fish, protectors of the undersea realm. Some said they enticed lonely sailors into watery graves. Others claimed they brought blessings to worthy men. He had no belief in tall tales, but something in his heart stirred whenever he caught glimpses of the unknown. "We've charted uncharted territories and seen wonders many men never dream of," he said. "Perhaps the merfolk are not so impossible." Corvin shrugged. "Aye, you've lived a charmed life so far, sir, but keep your wits about you. The men might talk, but they obey. For now." With that ominous note, Corvin left. Alexander remained on deck listening to the waves. He had no idea that below those very waters, his every move was being watched by a pair of deep green eyes belonging to a curious mermaid named Ashera. Deep beneath the ocean's surface, far from the mortal hustle above, lay the vast realm of the merfolk. Coral towers spiraled upward like underwater spires, and schools of neon fish illuminated shadowy reefs with bursts of brilliant color. The seafloor was a kingdom unlike any on land, filled with bioluminescent flora that lit winding caverns like underwater lanterns. Ashera glided gracefully among these coral forests. Her tail shimmered with teal gold and flecks of crimson, a pattern said to be rare among her kind. She was known for her ambition. Her insatiable curiosity led her to explore the outskirts of the kingdom, brushing close to the boundary lines that separated merfolk territory from the dangerous realm of humans. Long had she heard the tales whispered by others, stories of a human naval officer who had conquered the seas with cunning and ferocity. Some mermaids spoke of him with admiration, his bravery in battle and merciful acts after victories. Others warned of his potential threat, claiming he was a demon in a handsome disguise, driven by greed. Ashera's father, a cautious elder of their court, had warned her never to approach human vessels. But the more he forbade it, the more Ashera found herself drawn to the surface. She surfaced often over the weeks, watching the _vermilion dawn from a distance. She had yet to see the famed general up close, but her heart fluttered at each silhouette that paced across the deck. When she finally spotted him one dawn, standing tall and regal against the rising sun, she felt a startling jolt inside her chest. Here was the fabled man who had weathered storms and pirates with equal aplomb. She could sense an aura of confidence about him, and though they were separated by more than mere physical distance, she found herself entranced by his presence. At first, Ashera stayed hidden. She told herself she wanted only to observe human customs, to see how the great conquerors of the sea carried themselves. But each time he turned his head, her pulse quickened. There was something in his gaze that hinted at a deeper complexity, a sorrow perhaps, or a flicker of unwavering determination. In those brief glimpses, Ashera realized that the man many called monster had more depth than the sea itself. Days passed. The _vermilion dawn carved a steady path toward the Isle of Ivory. Each day new tensions surfaced among the crew, though they tried to hide it. Gold weighed heavily on sailors' minds. The king's promise of a handsome reward for securing the exotic treasures of that perilous island hung in the air like a tempting perfume. Ashera lingered at a safe distance beneath the hull whenever Alexander's ship paused. She would listen with practiced patience. Her sensitive ears could pick up low murmurs through the wooden planks. Often she heard Alexander giving orders, precise, fair, and surprisingly considerate. He spoke of preserving enough rations, of caring for the wounded, of scouting the reefs to avoid losing men to hidden dangers. In these private, stolen moments her admiration only grew, but the conversation among the lower-ranked sailors had taken a darker turn. More than once, Ashera overheard hushed exchanges about the king's secret communications. A coded message had reached them by messenger gull, promising unimaginable wealth if they would remove Alexander from power. At first, some of the men balked. Could they truly betray the man who had led them through storms and wars, who had shared their rations when food was scarce? Yet greed was a fierce force. Whispers of Alexander's unearned favor from the king, and rumors that he might one day supplant the throne itself, began to take root in the weaker minds. The promise of gold was seductive. The idea that Alexander had grown too proud, overshadowing them all, gnawed at any misgivings they might have had. One evening, a violent thunderstorm swept in from the western horizon. Lightning lit up the skies in a jagged symphony. Sheets of rain hammered the decks, and the vessel bucked wildly atop towering waves. Crew members scrambled to secure the cannons, tie down flapping sails, and haul lines to keep the ship from capsizing. During these moments of fear, the crew instinctively turned to Alexander, their anchor in the chaos. "Sailors, to the mainmast," he bellowed over the roar of thunder. "We'll ride out this storm or die trying." His voice was iron. In that perilous night, the men were reminded of why they respected him, of how he'd always guided them through every disaster. When the sun finally broke through the clouds at dawn, the crew realized that they'd taken minimal damage, surviving a gale that could have easily torn lesser ships to driftwood. They cheered, crowding the rails to watch the calming sea. Many felt a surge of gratitude for Alexander's unflagging courage. But for some, that triumph only stoked their envy. If he had succumbed to the sea, they might have avoided the moral quagmire of betrayal. Instead, he was stronger than ever, admired, unstoppable, and perhaps destined to overshadow the king. They looked at each other with conspiratorial nods. There was gold in betrayal and an easy solution to ending his unstoppable legend. Beneath the waves, Ashera had battled her own turmoil through the storm. High winds had tossed the surf into confusion, scattering fish and swirling currents in ways even she, a swift swimmer, could barely endure. Still, she had fought to remain near the hull to watch over Alexander in a strange act of devotion. When the waves stilled, she peered up at the sailors. She could see relief on their faces, but in some, a simmering darkness. Though she couldn't hear every word in the howling wind, she sensed a plot forming like a sickness in the waters. After days of arduous travel, the _Vermilion Dawn finally approached the Isle of Ivory. Glittering stretches of bone-white sand surrounded jagged cliffs, and the water near shore was an impossible shade of aqua. Coral reefs fanned out in intricate patterns beneath the surface, and further out, one could see the deeper shadows where sea creatures large and small prowled. Alexander ordered a smaller launch boat to explore the coastline for a secure anchorage. Cliffs jutted high, preventing easy docking. Ultimately, they found a hidden cove lined with pale rocks, where the ship could safely remain while a few men explored. Though the morning sky was clear, an unsettling aura clung to the island. Rumors spoke of ghostly phenomena, cursed treasures, and monstrous guardians. Yet Alexander's composure remained unshaken. "We make camp ashore," he commanded, "while we scout for pearls and other valuables. Keep a tight formation and do nothing rash. This island is as treacherous as it is beautiful." His seasoned officers nodded, though some exchanged knowing looks. As the men descended into rowboats, Ashera watched from behind coral outcroppings beneath the waves. Her keen senses told her the island was indeed a realm of hidden reefs and swirling currents, very dangerous, especially for a large ship. She considered revealing herself, urging Alexander to be cautious. But something made her hesitate, perhaps fear of rejection or the mere fact that the man might see her as an oddity to be captured. She bit her lip, feeling more conflicted than ever. Once on the island, Alexander split his men into search parties. They combed the beaches, turning over shells and gleaning what pearls they could find from the shallows. All seemed well, though an ominous hush hung in the air. Midway through their second day, Corvin approached Alexander by a cluster of tide pools, claiming a large deposit of pearls had been found just around a rocky bend. Alexander followed. He trusted Corvin implicitly, having fought battles side by side, sharing salted biscuits during storms and navigating uncharted coasts. When they reached the place, however, only a few men awaited them, men whose eyes glinted with a mix of fear and greed. "Admiral," Corvin said softly, "the king commanded us to do this. Forgive me." An explosion of gunfire and a clash of swords shattered the stillness. Alexander, quick as lightning, managed to parry the first strike, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. At least 10 conspirators closed in on him. He fought valiantly, his saber whirling in lethal arcs. 2 betrayers fell with cries of pain. But the ring closed tighter, steel glinting in the sun, forming a prison of blades. A sharp blow from behind cut through his uniform and sank into his flesh, sending blood running down his back. Breathing ragged, Alexander dropped to one knee. The king's letter had demanded his removal, and the greedy men had set this trap, guided by their promise of gold. He looked around, eyes filled with both fury and heartbreak. Men he had considered brothers stood over him with drawn guns and swords. Corvin, trembling, approached with the final blow. Alexander spat blood and glared at him. No words escaped his lips, only bitter disbelief that loyalty could be so cheaply bought. Then darkness descended. He collapsed on the ground, consciousness ebbing as the conspirators yanked off his sword belt. In the distance, he heard jeers and the jingle of coins. He felt himself being dragged across the beach, carried in a rowboat, then thrown overboard near the reef so his body would vanish in the ocean's embrace. The last thing he saw before blackness claimed him was a glimmer of sunlight on water and the broken pieces of his dream of loyal service. Ashera had sensed the shift in energy near the island. She had lingered in the deeper waters, half submerged in worry that the men might discover her. When she saw a small rowboat returning from the beach, a chill trickled through her. She recognized Corvin and several others, but Alexander was nowhere in sight. Something was terribly wrong. Drawing on her speed, she followed them at a distance, eventually seeing them throw a limp form into the ocean with callous disregard. Horror slammed into her chest. She knew instantly who it was. The traitorous men did not linger. They rowed back toward the _Vermilion Dawn _, no doubt ready to spin their tale of how Alexander had perished by accident or in some contrived skirmish. With powerful thrusts of her tail, Ashera raced to the sinking figure, her webbed hands slicing through the water in desperation. The deeper she swam, the darker the water became, until she could just make out Alexander's silhouette, drifting down like a broken marionette. He was unconscious, blood blooming around him like a crimson veil. Her heart pounded in her ears. The legends were true after all. He was a man who had faced countless dangers, only to be betrayed by those he trusted most. Summoning every ounce of strength, Ashera wrapped an arm around his waist, mindful of his wounds. She could see he still clung to a faint thread of life. Carefully, she raised him to the surface, pushing as hard as she could. Breaking through the waves, she gasped for air and cradled his head above the water. Salt and brine clung to his lips, and his breathing was barely detectable. Ashera spotted a small hidden lagoon a short distance away. Maneuvering his heavy, unconscious body, she towed him there, her tail shimmering with fierce determination. The lagoon's entrance was lined with rocks, making it impassable for large ships but perfect for a mermaid to slip through. Inside, a pristine shoreline of white sand curved away from lush palms and thick greenery. Small waterfalls trickled into the lagoon, creating a serene, secluded paradise. Once ashore, Ashera carefully laid Alexander on the sand. She hovered over him, checking his wounds. His uniform was torn, soaked in blood. A deep slash marred his right side near the ribs, and bruises covered his arms. Panic welled in her chest. She had knowledge of marine herbs for small scrapes, but these wounds were severe. With a shaky breath, Ashera darted back into the water to gather what she could from nearby reefs, sticky seaweeds with natural coagulant properties, a certain type of algae used by merfolk as a disinfectant. Returning to him, she pressed the seaweeds against his wounds, whispering gentle words in her own language, praying to the old gods of her people for help. She had never before cared for a human so intimately. Slowly, the bleeding lessened. Nightfall arrived, veiling the secret lagoon in soft moonlight. Ashera remained by Alexander's side, occasionally wetting his lips with fresh water she collected in a shell. He moaned in his delirium, skin feverish. His eyes flickered open just once, cloudy with pain, catching the shimmering outline of Ashera's tail. He tried to speak, but no words came. She stroked his damp hair, coaxing him to rest, fighting back tears she barely understood. Over the next days, Ashera tirelessly tended to Alexander. She learned to weave makeshift bandages from torn bits of sailcloth found on the shore, rinsing them clean in the waterfall and applying layers of salve, made from crushed coral and beneficial algae. Each evening, she sang the soft lullabies of her people, hoping the resonance of her voice might soothe him. In the quiet hush of the lagoon, time seemed suspended, the outside world momentarily forgotten. After 3 days, Alexander finally stirred. He blinked, wincing at the pain from his side. He felt something cold and damp around his torso. Bandages? Then he realized he was lying on the sand in a cove that was not familiar. The sound of trickling water mingled with gentle waves against the shore. A sweet, haunting melody reached his ears. He turned his head toward the sound. There, perched on a smooth rock near the water's edge, was the most ethereal being he had ever seen. Ashera's long hair cascaded around her face in gentle waves, and her upper body was draped in a piece of cloth she had salvaged from an old sail. But below her waist extended the gleaming, iridescent scales of her tail, glowing softly in the moonlit cove. For a moment he thought he must still be feverish, but as she noticed him awaken, her singing stopped, and she approached cautiously. He tried to sit upright but hissed in pain. She quickly pressed a gentle hand to his shoulder. "You must rest," she said, her voice melodic but tinged with concern. "Your wounds are not fully healed." "What are you?" he managed through parched lips. A faint smile touched her lips. "You know what I am, I think. We mermaids are not as secret as we once were, though many of my kind prefer to remain hidden." He stared at her in disbelief, mind reeling. "You saved me?" She nodded. "Your men—" She hesitated, remembering the scene of betrayal she had half witnessed. "They cast you into the sea. I couldn't let you drown." A heavy silence settled over them. Alexander's memories returned in fragments. The scowling faces of his traitorous crew, Corvin's trembling apology, the bite of cold steel. Betrayal. Rage flared in his chest, igniting a grim determination. But that fury was tempered by the softness in Ashera's gaze. She had risked her own safety, exposing herself to a human, to save him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice still rough. It was more than gratitude. Those two words held the essence of his very life. She gave him water and guided him to lie back down, her gentle care soothing his battered spirit. For that moment, he allowed himself to simply exist in her presence, letting the sorrow and anger ebb. In the following days, Ashera continued to nurse Alexander, introducing him to the marvels of the lagoon. She crushed seashells into medicinal pastes to help his wounds heal faster, helped him drink from the waterfall to regain strength, and coaxed him into eating the soft meat of coconuts that grew abundantly in the surrounding palm trees. He moved gingerly, the pain in his side a reminder that the mermaid's swift intervention had been all that prevented a watery grave. Though he tried to remain stoic, often Alexander found himself entranced by Ashera's presence. She knew so much about the sea, more than any navigator he had ever worked with. She spoke of currents and tides as though they were living spirits, each with its own personality. She knew which corals could be ground into a nutrient paste, which seashells held tiny creatures with healing properties. Under her guidance, he formed a new understanding of the sea he'd thought he had already mastered. He confided in her, telling her of his childhood as a fisherman's son, hungry for a life beyond the small harbor town he once called home. He had enlisted in the king's navy as a teenager, fighting his way up the ranks with grit and cunning. He also spoke of the fatherly mentor he'd once had, an old admiral who recognized his potential and groomed him for leadership. Loss and victory, heartbreak and triumph, all poured forth as he recounted his rise in rank until he found himself at the apex of power, too close to threaten the king's ego. Ashera listened with rapt attention. In exchange, she revealed snippets of her life beneath the waves. She spoke of the merfolk society with its ancient customs, the bioluminescent gardens that lit their festivals, and the cautionary tales told to her children about venturing too close to human ships. "Some say humans hunt us," she said, her voice taking on a note of sadness. "Others say humans are cursed. I never knew which to believe." Alexander managed a weak smile, ignoring the twinge in his ribs. "Humans can be both noble and cruel, as you have seen. It seems your stories ring true in many ways." One moonlit night, as the tide filled the lagoon with shimmering reflections, Alexander and Ashera sat close on a flat rock near the water. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby palm trees. He studied her face, illuminated by starlight, and realized he felt safer, more at peace than he had in years. Her eyes, radiant as jewels, mirrored the gentle wonder of the ocean itself. A stray thought found its way into his mind. What if he never left this lagoon? But he forced it aside. He was still a man with a mission, a man betrayed. He had vowed loyalty to the king, yet it was the king's order that had nearly killed him. All he had believed in was shattered. Ashera sensed his turmoil, pressing a small, cool hand over his. It was an unspoken promise. She would stand with him no matter what he decided. And in that silent vow, a different kind of bond began to form. When Alexander finally regained enough strength to walk around the lagoon and gingerly climb across the rocks, his thoughts hardened into a singular resolve. Vengeance. He had been robbed of his honor, humiliated, and left for dead. The men who had betrayed him were undoubtedly on their way back to collect the king's gold, perhaps spreading lies about his demise. One morning he stood at the water's edge, flexing his still sore arm and testing his range of motion. His reflection in the clear lagoon startled him. It showed a changed man. His uniform was in tatters, his hair unkempt, and a fierce scar marked his side. Gone was the immaculate Navy general. In his place stood a man hardened by betrayal and kept alive by a mermaid's mercy. Ashera, perched on a nearby rock, approached him. "What will you do now?" He glanced at her. "I cannot return to the Navy. Even if I did, I would be branded a traitor or an outlaw. The king has already spun his web. My name is probably stricken from the rolls. Everything I built is lost." Her eyes filled with compassion. "But not your courage. You still have that." A grim smile formed on his lips. "Courage alone doesn't restore justice. I will have my revenge on those who wronged me, Corvin and his lot, and most especially the king who orchestrated it all." She studied his face. "Is that truly what you want?" He hesitated. "I want justice. I want them to know they cannot simply discard me. If no kingdom will have me, then I'll carve my own path on the sea. Pirate's life, perhaps." The word pirate hung heavily between them. For years, Alexander had been a scourge to pirates. Now, irony forced him to consider aligning himself with their kind. But his was a different quest. He wouldn't raid merchant ships at random, or rob innocent coastal villages. His vendetta was singular. He wanted only to strike at the heart of betrayal. If the king had used gold as a means to buy his downfall, Alexander would use cunning and might to bring the king's warships to their knees. Softly, Ashera laid her hand on his shoulder. "Then I'll help you. I know secret reefs and underwater tunnels. I know ways to evade detection. We can find a crew if you trust the right people. Not all humans are faithless." For a moment he was speechless. Could this mermaid from a realm so alien to his own truly be willing to share his burden? He nodded, eyes shining with gratitude. "You've already saved my life. I can't ask for more." She shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "You didn't ask, I offer freely. Besides," her voice turned playful, "I have my own reasons. I've never much liked the idea of doing nothing while a tyrant rules." He let out a short laugh, an almost unfamiliar sound after the trials he'd endured. Something about her honesty and fierce independence resonated with him in a way nothing else ever had. For the first time in his life, he felt an equally matched partner by his side, not in rank, but in spirit. As night deepened, Ashera guided Alexander through a hidden underwater passage that led from the lagoon to the open sea. She wrapped his torso in salvaged waterskins inflated with air, teaching him how to hold his breath in short bursts as she towed him through the submerged tunnel. The route was short, and soon they emerged beyond the rocky outer rim of the island. They set out in a small rowboat that the betrayers had left in the shallows. Ashera, half in and half out of the water, kicked her powerful tail, helping move the little craft at a surprising speed. Soon, they reached a desolate stretch of coastline on another part of the isle. On the beach, half buried in sand, lay the wreckage of an older sloop. Storms over the years had smashed it to pieces. Alexander's eyes were keen, noting salvageable wood and rigging. They spent the night scouting the wreckage for anything usable. Sails that could be patched, rope that still held some strength, iron nails that had not rusted completely. As the sun rose, they had a small cache of materials. Alexander explained his plan. We can't build a ship out of this debris, but we can signal or bribe the right sort of sailors, those the king has wronged or those with no love for the crown. They'll join us if we promise them a share of whatever spoils we claim. But how will we find them? Ashera asked. Alexander's lips curled into a cunning grin. There are ports scattered across these seas, ports that owe no allegiance to any kingdom, lawless harbors, where smugglers, privateers, and yes, pirates, gather. One such port is called Wavemist Cove, not far from here. I can almost guarantee we'll find men of fortune there who'll follow me, for a price. Ashera listened carefully. The idea of venturing into human ports was nerve-wracking, yet thrilling. But the bond she felt toward Alexander steeled her courage. She volunteered to guide them through a lesser-known channel full of swirling currents near the cove's entrance. It would allow them to approach undetected, bypassing any watchers who might betray them to the king. They spent another day resting, then set out. It was a strange sight, a single battered rowboat gliding across calm seas, guided by a mermaid and helmed by a disgraced naval hero. Though Alexander was not fully recovered, his resolve was unstoppable, fueling every stroke of the oar. With Ashera's knowledge of the currents, they reached Wavemist Cove by moonlight. A sprawling settlement hugged the shoreline, its ramshackle docks crowded with smaller vessels. Fires burned in braziers, and the raucous sound of drunken voices carried over the water. This was a place that catered to fortune hunters and exiles alike, a patchwork of taverns, brothels, and hidden warehouses. A place where, if you had coin or cunning, you could build an army or fall victim to one. Ashera hid among the rocks, watching as Alexander pulled the rowboat onto a deserted stretch of beach. Her heart fluttered with unease. He turned back, meeting her gaze through the gloom. "Wait for me here," he said softly. "I won't be long." She nodded. Watching him walk away, she was struck by how much he had changed, dressed in scavenged clothes, a sword belted at his hip, moving with a quiet, predatory grace. No longer the polished hero of the Navy, he had taken on the lean look of a wolf among sheep. She realized with a pang of empathy that the betrayal had not just scarred his body, but also his soul. Alexander slipped into the crowded taverns and hidden corners of Wavemist Cove. He found old contacts, smugglers once imprisoned by the king, privateers who had lost royal permits, even a few old Navy men drummed out for insubordination. Rumors spread quickly. The legendary general was alive and he was assembling a crew. Some doubted. Others gaped in awe. Alexander, though bruised by betrayal, still radiated an undeniable magnetism. It took him 3 nights of negotiating, gambling, and carefully doled out bribes. At times he quietly mentioned the hidden treasures that might await them if they dared to strike at the heart of the king's shipping lanes. Tales of Alexander's cunning brought eager ears. Within those rickety tavern walls, a new legion formed, men bound by neither loyalty nor fear of the crown, but by promises of wealth and a chance at revenge against the monarchy that had cast them aside. They swore an oath in the smoky back room of the Sea Serpent's Tooth Tavern, each man cutting a palm and clasping hands in solidarity. Alexander looked into their determined eyes, a mismatch of scoundrels, skilled sailors, and disgruntled outcasts, all united under his cause, and Ashera's. In his heart he felt a twinge of guilt that the mermaid was so deeply entangled in a human conflict, yet he also knew he couldn't have accomplished this alone. On the 3rd night, the newly minted crew marched to a sleek brigantine anchored in a hidden cove. It belonged to a privateer who had grown disillusioned with the king's empty promises. With the crew's combined funds, and in exchange of future plunder shares, they took control of the vessel. Alexander stood on the quarterdeck, letting the night wind ruffle his hair. He took the wheel, feeling that long-forgotten rush of command. No Navy uniform adorned him now, but a simple black coat with a broad belt for his cutlass. That night they departed Wavemist Cove under the cloak of darkness. Once clear of the harbor, Alexander guided the brigantine toward the rocks where Ashera waited. She emerged from the water, breath-catching at the sight of the new ship with lanterns glowing along its rails. A quiet cheer rose from the deck as the crew realized that the rumors of a mermaid ally were true. With grace, she climbed a rope ladder Alexander lowered, pulling herself onto the deck. "Welcome aboard," he said quietly, a small, reassuring smile on his lips. She returned his smile, though her heart pounded at the number of curious stares fixed on her. Still, the respect in their eyes was clear. She was no hostage, but a partner. One or two men clutched small charms or muttered prayers, fearing curses. Yet none dared challenge Alexander's orders. Thus, on this moonlit deck, a mermaid and a betrayed hero stood side by side, bound by an unbreakable promise. Over the next weeks, the brigantine, newly christened Serena's Heart, ranged far across the seas, launching a series of lightning raids against the king's trading vessels. Alexander had no qualms targeting the crown's merchant ships, each laden with goods and gold bound for the royal coffers. Word spread like wildfire that a cunning pirate captain was systematically crippling the king's maritime trade. Their success was not solely due to Alexander's tactics, though they were formidable. Ashera's knowledge of hidden reefs and swirling currents let them appear and disappear where no ship was thought to be able to navigate. More than once she led them through underwater channels that flanked heavily guarded ports, letting the crew launch surprise attacks. She also served as an unexpected secret weapon in naval skirmishes, using her underwater agility to sabotage enemy rudders or slip aboard enemy ships undetected, sowing chaos. In these days of blood and plunder, Alexander's thirst for revenge was nearly unquenchable, yet whenever he felt his anger pushing him toward unnecessary cruelty, Ashera's gentle presence brought him back. Her voice, her touch, reminded him that humanity was not just a source of betrayal. It could also foster love and devotion. Despite the hardened men around them, a quiet romance blossomed between Ashera and Alexander. They would linger on deck late into the night, sharing whispered stories, or slip away to the captain's cabin for moments of tender intimacy, free from watchful eyes. One evening, after a successful raid on a royal galleon, they stood at the ship's stern, watching the moonlight shimmer across the waves. Ashera rested her head against his shoulder. "Have you thought about what happens when this is all over?" she asked softly. "When you've taken your revenge?" He exhaled slowly, gaze distant. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to believe the seas will be mine, that I can sail away from the memory of betrayal. But even if I destroy the king's fleet, the pain will remain." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pain lingers, but it's in your power to decide what shape your future takes. Perhaps there's something else you can build. Something built on trust, not just vengeance." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. In that embrace, he felt the simple truth. Vengeance alone wouldn't fill the hollow ache inside him. The real treasure he had found was standing beside him. A creature as free as the sea itself, whose love asked for nothing but honesty in return. The king, enraged by the sudden havoc on his shipping lanes, spared no expense in assembling a massive flotilla to crush this new pirate threat. Rumors carried word of half a dozen warships, bristling with cannons commanded by his most trusted admirals. Leading them was none other than Corvin, newly promoted and rewarded for his loyalty. At last, the day of reckoning arrived. Off the coast of a rugged cape, the king's flotilla intercepted the Serena's Heart _. The weather was brisk, with a slicing wind kicking up whitecaps. Alexander stood at the helm, gaze locked on the hostile ships arrayed against them. This was the very type of confrontation he had won countless times in the name of the crown, but never as a pirate. "Captain," one of his new first mates, a scarred privateer named Lion, called out. "They've got us outnumbered 3-1. Alexander's mouth curved into a confident smirk. "Let them come. We have the advantage of maneuverability." Then he turned to Ashera. "Are you ready?" She nodded, slipping over the side of the vessel into the churning sea. Once underwater, she could coordinate with smaller teams of divers and sabotage the warships. The plan was bold. Lure the king's ships close to a rocky outcropping, then disable their steering or damage their hulls. Cannons roared across the water. Smoke enveloped the decks, and the stench of gunpowder filled the air. The Sirena's heart weaved in and out, returning fire with precise aim. Though outnumbered, their advantage lay in speed and cunning. Ashera guided a group of loyal swimmers, attaching rope lines to the rudder of one warship, yanking it off course. The vessel crashed into another in the confusion, tangling rigging and toppling masts. Explosions rumbled as cannonballs found their marks, sending splinters of wood flying. Amid the chaos, Corvin's flagship, a grand galleon named _Royal Conquest _, loomed into firing range. Alexander ordered the helm hard to starboard, evading a devastating broadside. The two ships drew parallel, and grappling hooks soared across the gap. A harrowing clash ensued as pirates boarded the king's vessel, blades flashing. Shots rang out, echoing across the waves. Alexander leapt aboard the _Royal Conquest _, sword in hand. His eyes blazed with cold fury. Corvin appeared on the quarterdeck, a pistol at the ready. For a moment they stood still, the swirl of battle raging around them. "You," Corvin spat, "you're supposed to be dead." "So you tried," Alexander replied, voice steady with barely contained rage. "Now it's time to pay for your treachery." They lunged. Corvin fired a shot, the bullet grazing Alexander's left arm, but he ignored the pain. Steel clashed, sparks flying. Though Corvin had skill, he was no match for the man he once followed. Alexander's swordsmanship was swift and lethal. With a final parry, he disarmed Corvin, kicking him to the deck. Across the ship, men bellowed and the wounded screamed. Smoke thickened the air, but Alexander's focus never wavered from the trembling traitor at his feet. Corvin stared up, eyes flicking between fear and defiance. Blood dripped from Alexander's arm, but he raised his sword. "Mercy," Corvin croaked. "It was the king. The king commanded it. I had no choice." Alexander tightened his jaw. In that moment he recalled all the loyalty he had shown Corvin, all the trust they had shared. Rage built within him. He saw Corvin's betrayal for what it was, a coward's choice. Sucking in a breath, he steadied his sword arm. Then, with one swift motion, he ended Corvin's life. The traitor's eyes widened, then closed forever. A hush fell around them. The pirates, emboldened by Alexander's triumph, fought with renewed vigor, driving the remaining loyalists to surrender or retreat. Meanwhile, Ashera and her underwater allies sabotaged the last warship's rudder, causing it to slam against a jagged reef. Within an hour, the king's vaunted flotilla lay in ruins, some sunk, others burning, and a few limping away, battered and broken. His blade still dripping. Amid the carnage, his gaze searched the water for Ashera. Relief flooded him when he saw her emerge over the hull. She climbed aboard, hair plastered to her shoulders, chest heaving. A smile crossed her lips, though exhaustion dulled her eyes. They shared a lingering look, an understanding that they had just reshaped the power dynamics of the sea. The king's might was broken. The aftermath of the battle left the ocean scattered with debris. Pirate crews towed captured vessels, loaded with spoils and potential new recruits from among the disillusioned or forcibly conscripted sailors. The day was theirs. Yet an uneasy question lurked. What of the king himself? He was not present on the flagship. He remained in the capital, blissfully ignorant of how thoroughly his ambition had collapsed. Alexander clenched his fists at the thought of confronting the puppet master in person. But this was the high seas, his seas now, and if the king wanted to send more ships, let him. None would stand against the infamous pirate who wore the face of a fallen hero. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Alexander and Ashera withdrew to the privacy of the captain's cabin. Through the windows, they could see the drifting smoke of the defeated fleet. Alexander poured 2 cups of rum, an ironic toast for a man who had once prided himself on naval discipline. He handed one to Ashera. "To victory," he said, holding his cup aloft. His voice held no jubilation, only a tired finality. She clinked her shell cup gently against his. "To the end of treachery." They drank. Silence filled the cabin, bearing all the weight of what had just occurred. Alexander knew he had achieved the vengeance he had vowed. Those who betrayed him were destroyed, their ambitions turned to ash. And yet as he studied Ashera's face in the flickering lantern light, he felt a pang. Vengeance was a hollow whine, and he yearned now for more than the ruin of his enemies. He yearned for a future that gave purpose to his life. And he realized with clarity that purpose lay in the mermaid before him. Leaning closer, he placed a gentle hand on Ashera's cheek. "You've done so much for me," he whispered. "I don't deserve such loyalty." Her eyes shone. "Loyalty isn't earned by deserving. It's given because it's wanted. Because I believe in you." A tremor went through him, a release of the bitterness that had gripped his heart since the betrayal. He lowered his head, and their lips met in a tender kiss that spoke of relief, gratitude, and a budding love that could rise from the darkest depths. In the weeks that followed, the pirate confederation Alexander had assembled claimed dominance of the seas. With the king's main fleet decimated and word spreading of the formidable mermaid ally, fewer and fewer captains dared challenge them. Alexander established a code of conduct. No raiding neutral villages, no harming innocent sailors. Their war was with the crown and those who upheld its tyranny. Surprising as it was to some of the cutthroats in his employ, the men found they could still reap wealth by targeting only the king's ships. Merchants from foreign nations even began to offer private contracts for protection from royal interference. Yet for all the success, a sense of restlessness stirred in Alexander. He spent most nights standing at the bow, gazing at the starlit sky. Ashera often joined him, weaving her fingers through his, the sea breeze whispering across her scales. The more time they spent together, the deeper their bond grew. Their union felt as if it spanned worlds, his realm of deck and sail, and her realm of currents and coral. One twilight anchored off a chain of uninhabited islands. He caught her unrolling a small coral scroll from her underwater kingdom, a map of merfolk tunnels and hidden grottos. "I want to show you my home," she explained, pointing at a swirl of lines that denoted a massive coral reef. "There's a place where the reefs rise so high they nearly break the surface. You could anchor your ship there. We could explore together, show you the wonders beneath the waves." His heart warmed. "I'd like nothing more, but your people, would they accept me?" She hesitated. "Some might. Others would fear you. But if they see you as I do, they'll learn you're not just a conqueror. You have a heart that seeks justice." His grip tightened on the map. A warmth flared in his chest, a yearning for a place beyond conflict, beyond revenge. Could he truly bridge the gap between merfolk and human? In that moment, he made a decision. They would find a new life, one not defined solely by piracy or betrayal. His men had their gold, and if they wished to sail under a new banner of independence, they could do so. But his path lay with Ashera. Perhaps they would remain at sea, forging a bond between two worlds. He was no longer the king's man. He was not even fully a pirate at heart. He was something new. Someone who drew strength from the deep and loyalty from those who believed in him. And above all, he was in love with a mermaid whose faith in him shattered any remaining chains of bitterness.